I think that China is attempting to run a bit of a natural experiment in what we might think of as a more authoritarian, innovation-driven economy, whether, for instance, enormous state-directed investment with this political environment of fear, with the chilling effect on innovation that is accompanied by, whether that can produce more than just short-term returns. Of course, if you plow money into a specific sector that you've identified as being, high potential or high risk for you in terms of your vulnerability to other countries being in charge of global supply chains, of course you can get short-term returns. But whether that will actually create a long-term, innovation-driven economy, as they say, I think certainly too early to tell. But I have noticed over the past year that a rhetoric of self-reliance, of not needing to depend on the United States and other developed countries for technology and other fundamental forms of the new economy, that is a really central plank of Xi Jinping's vision of the world.
I'm here today with Julian Gewirtz, an Academy Fellow at Harvard University. We're here to talk about China and his book, Unlikely Partners, Chinese Reformers, Western Economists, and the Making of Global China. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
What inspired this book? Where did you start? Take us to the origins.
Sure. As I began to study China and think about the extraordinary transformation that China has gone through over the past 40 years, it immediately became clear to me that there were some fundamental questions that historians, my training, had an opportunity to begin researching and learning about. One of those questions was really a fundamental question about the economy. How had the socialist market economy, that is still the designation of China's economy today, how had that socialist market economy come into being, developed over 20 or 30 years of debate and policy contestation? As I began to look into that question, I realized that one part of the story we didn't know much about, but that was central at the time, was the role of economists from outside of China, from both sides of the Cold War world, in interacting with, consulting with the Chinese leadership. And as I kept looking into it, I realized this was an extraordinarily broad and deep effort to learn from economists of a very wide ideological background, led by the Chinese leadership, done on their own terms.
So they brought together economists from around the world. I know Kornoy from Hungary,
Exactly.
Milton Friedman from Chicago,
Yeah,
my old friend Gregory Chow from Princeton University.
exactly.
Was he a curator? Was he kind of at the center of detecting who should be brought to the table?
Really, from the moment that Mao died, the Chinese officials and economists began to try to figure out who they should bring, who should they be talking to about the way in which their economy could begin to grow. Because, of course, China was very poor. In 1978, per capita GDP of about 175 US dollars. And a figure like Gregory Chow was a crucial intermediary because he was an economist who was of Chinese descent, was teaching at Princeton, so he was able to move between those two worlds, to speak in Chinese to the Chinese leadership, also to speak in the language of economics in the United States, and to help them figure out who might be the right figures to bring. And indeed, many economists from the West, before they went to China, figures like Kornoy and indeed like Milton Friedman, talked to Gregory Chow, said, what's going on in China? What should I say, or what can I say that would be in line with my beliefs, but also would speak to and connect with the concerns of the Chinese leadership? You know, another figure who played that role was someone named Edwin Lim, who was the chief of mission for the World Bank. And he, also a figure who could move between and among these various cultures, had a really extraordinary role as an intermediary in addition to being experts in their own right.
Who in China became what you might call the vanguard, or at the core of the thinking? Who rose to the top as a result of this process?
So to answer that question, I think I first need to say a little bit about the Chinese side of these exchanges and the dynamics in China. So At that time, there was a broad policy direction that was set by the Chinese leadership under Deng Xiaoping. The key economic official was the Prime Minister, Zhao Ziyang. And Zhao instructed his officials, and indeed economists who would come brief him, Chinese economists, to learn from the socialist world, the capitalist world, and people who had moved between those two worlds. So very quickly, an array of Chinese economists began to develop relationships, personal and intellectual relationships, with Chinese thinkers. And the economist who I think is emblematic of this is someone named Julian. And Wu was someone who began studying English very intensively right after the Cultural Revolution. He immediately set about trying to read and learn about what had happened in economics over that decade of tumult and chaos in China. And one of the people that he and some of his colleagues identified was Janusz Kornai. Kornai had grown up in Hungary, had grown up within a socialist economy, but then had taken up a position at Harvard and was a critic of classical socialist economics. And for Wu Jinglian, meeting Kornai for the first time in 1981, right after Kornai had published Economics of Shortage, which was his seminal book, was an experience that he described as a kind of revelation. Now, not because he just thought Kornai was right in the abstract, but because suddenly he had a language and a conceptual framework for talking about some of the problems that China had experienced in a new way. And so this process of learning and encountering ideas from abroad enabled Chinese reformers to make more effective arguments in their own context on their own terms. To answer your question directly, Kornai, I think, was probably the most popular of the array of foreign economists in this period. There was even a vogue called Kornai fever. You know, it was so popular, it was constantly being quoted and all of that. But other economists were really influential from, again, as I said, a wide ideological background. I mean, you have on the one hand Milton Friedman, who was not so influential with the Chinese leadership, but did develop a real public following and was a figure of real popular interest, though the Chinese leadership was firm that his free market fundamentalism was not acceptable. And then you have a variety of other folks who come primarily out of the socialist world, people like Oda Schick, a Czech economist, but were very influential in shaping the way that Chinese economists thought about the problems of their own economy.
Were there any breakdowns? Were there things where this is just intractable, we have to go our separate ways, or can't invite you back to the meeting?
One of the real themes of this period in my book and in my research is contestation. The reforms were never taken for granted, and they were never inevitable. And indeed, this applied also to engagement with foreign economists. One example is that Oda Schick met with all of the senior economic officials. He was very influential in helping them think about price reform, which is a central question in the early socialist reform period. But after he left, despite the fact that Zhao Ziyang had personally pushed for him to be designated an official advisor, he wasn't invited back. And indeed, I was able to discover that he was denounced in a propaganda department directive as anti-Marxist. And that was why he wasn't invited back. Milton Friedman, less surprisingly, was criticized quite fiercely on his first trip in 1980. He went because the Chinese side had heard of him. He was so famous, and they had a view that inflation was the real scourge of capitalist countries, and that Milton Friedman didn't like inflation. And indeed, I found a banking official who gave a speech in this period who said, Milton Friedman is opposed to inflation, we are opposed to inflation, and therefore we likely agree. Little did they know, of course, that they were going to get a strong dose of highly ideological free market fundamentalism. So that trip was a bit of a disaster in 1980. Friedman gave a dinner table conversation where he denounced Marx and said that, Marx had been flatly wrong in his predictions about the demise of capitalism. And after, his host took him up to a hotel room and gave him a lecture on the triumphs of the Chinese Communist Party and let him know that that was not going to be acceptable at that time.
What's coming along for 10 or 15 years that's setting the stage or creating the pressure for this kind of interaction?
So the dominant driver of these interactions really was a sense from the top leadership that China had fallen behind and lost its way. That meant a variety of things. First, that meant the Chinese people were poor and that they didn't want that to be the case, and that they thought, the Chinese leadership in this case, that they should steer and create a direction for the changes that were happening via bottom-up ferment around the country in any case. The other dimension of this is a sense that the ideology of Maoism had led the country astray, that the Cultural Revolution had been a disaster. Of course, it had been a personal disaster for many of these officials, like Deng Xiaoping, who had been purged. So it was easy to see these personal and ideological and political forces, as well as the economic forces, converging. But one of the things that I found was really extraordinary as I dug into this material is that the Chinese leadership in the 1970s and indeed well into the 1980s did not have a strong sense of where they were going. Sometimes in accounts of this period, there's a kind of teleology that gets put back onto it. There's a sense that everything that was happening was unfolding almost inevitably. But Zhao Ziyang wrote in his posthumously published memoirs that when the reforms got underway in the 1980s, he had no idea where they were heading. He did not have a goal model in mind. And as a result, you can begin to see why talking to figures from all around the world, getting a broad array of inputs and advice into the process, in addition to domestic experimentation, seeing which ideas bubble up from the different provinces, why that array would be exactly what a leader might want if the goal was to figure out what can we do that's new? How can we guide this massive country into a direction of greater wealth and power and modernization?
In my own reading of China, say going back to the time of the Opium Wars, there's a tremendous angst associated with being the Middle Kingdom and then having the British with these new technologies exert a kind of dominance, followed by the Japanese invasion. And Mao's thrust, I think, in coming to power was to regain autonomy, but also the leadership status. Right. And there was often talk about a 100-year plan to get back to the frontier. I know Orville Schell's book, Wealth and Power, referred to this kind of what you might call collective desire to regain that preeminence. It feels to me like what you're talking about now around 1980 is a little before that vision has again really caught fire. As their success built up, right, the possibilities of preeminence like we face today and the tension over China 2025 and the knowledge-intensive economy and so forth. There's a vision of leadership now that's almost on the tip of everyone's tongue. But in that intermediate period, they had to find a way out after the Cultural Revolution. Grandeur wasn't the essence of it. It was just getting back on track.
That's right. So there's no doubt that the extraordinary growth we've witnessed from China over the past 40 years wildly surpassed the initial expectations and even the initial fantasies of the Chinese leaders in this period. It's a good reminder of the fact that it was really the entrepreneurial energy and hard work of the Chinese people that drove this, that they continually pushed beyond what even the Chinese leaders who helped instigate this process might have envisioned. I'd say a few things. One is that pursuit of growth at all costs has had real negative effects that China is continuing to grapple with. China today is the world's second largest economy, poised to become the world's largest, but they are now beginning to realize, and I would argue, that they're going to need to make real reforms to the way in which they handle poverty alleviation, Social Security, environmental protection, a whole array of really fundamental questions about Chinese society. On the flip side, though, I think that with Xi Jinping, we are seeing a degree of confidence in China's position and in the inexorable rise of China to global preeminence that would surprise even his most immediate predecessors. He has really, I think, looked at a post-2008 world, a world in which China and its model of political and economic order, and in which the particular dynamics of growth in China, he views as very favorable, an opportunity presented by new technologies for China to lead the way, not simply catch up. And so when I look at China today and I think about some of those themes that you just highlighted, this new sense of awakening, of being a superpower in a way that we didn't hear even 10 years ago, is really one of the most extraordinary changes underway. And when you go back to the 1980s and you realize that these current situations so far surpass what the Chinese leadership at that time thought, you can begin to understand something about Xi Jinping's confidence, even if one might wish that it came with a bit more caution or indeed had a completely different orientation.
A number of people, perhaps fearful of his confidence and the rise of China, are raising what you might call a dilemma. The centralized control under Xi Jinping thought is cast in tension with what you might call the bottom-up innovation of becoming the knowledge-intensive economy. How can you rule people from strength with fear and have them be unafraid of innovation at the same time?
Well, I think this is one of the truly central questions of our present moment and indeed of the future. And Xi Jinping has recently begun to sound this theme even more strongly in connection with the US-China trade war, which frankly is much larger than just a trade war. It really is the emergence of a kind of strategic competition, strategic rivalry that I don't think we've seen so explicitly before. And technology, these areas that you describe, are at the center of it. So when Xi Jinping says China needs to innovate, that's not only about the domestic economic model, that's not only about having bigger companies like Alibaba or having state-owned enterprises become engines of innovation in some way. That's also about a geopolitical environment where China's ability to have those entire technological ecosystems within its borders are really central to Xi Jinping's vision.
I think this place where you sit, which is addressing economic issues, but with a more textured, institutional, non-compartmentalized, with the weaving in of historical momentum and forces and processes, I think is a much more satisfying way to pursue understanding in our times. So
Thank you.
I wanted to thank you for being with us and for being a good example for the young scholars, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.